Today in our Art as Spiritual Expression unit, we will consider an artist, Vincent van Gogh, and a movement that was associated with his work, symbolism, capital S, and the exploration of interior states in art. This is going to depart quite dramatically from your meeting on Tuesday, in which you learned about the diversity of spiritual expression in the Islamic world and art giving form to religious ideas and devotion in Islam. Today, we're in a new context and we're narrowing in on the work of one artist in particular. Vincent van Gogh was born in the Netherlands, as we'll discuss, and worked feverishly in France in the late 19th century. And this was a secular context. Again, a context we'll get into a little bit more, but a secular world. And Van Gogh, a deeply religious and spiritual man, was trying to give form to some of these same impulses, some of these same feelings. Devotion, meditations on mortality, and feeling like a connection to a larger force, but without the specific modes of religious iconography. So a very different form, but some of the same guiding impulses here. Symbolism as a movement encouraged artists to free themselves from visual reality and instead use bold colors and simplified forms as expressive tools. In many ways, symbolism was a gateway to what we call modernism in Western art. The painting on your screen is Vincent van Gogh's Wheatfield with Reaper from 1889. You can probably tell this is not a subject of a religious figure or a deity, hybrid, or a deity from monotheism. This is not an object of devotion. In fact, it's quite an ordinary subject. This is a genre of painting we call landscape painting. And what we see is a wheat field with wind churning through the soft blades. A small figure on the left is cutting his way through a small path, harvesting the wheat in the left middle ground. The field is framed by an undulating mountain range and a mint green sky. But there's a sense that there's something more at play here, a sense of churning and movement, emotion. The activity of the artist's hands are visible in the raised brushstrokes, and these brushstrokes communicate a sense of turbulence, even spiritual unrest. Van Gogh was categorized as a symbolist artist, capital S, because he used representations of everyday objects to depict emotions and interior states and to explore big existential questions that had previously been thought through in religious artwork. Vincent van Gogh is maybe the first artist that's familiar to you so far this semester. He's a famous artist now, but he fits into the construction of the rediscovered artist. This is an artist whose talents were only recognized after their death, representing a kind of embodiment of worldly discontent with their modern age, so they were unrecognized, unappreciated in their own lives. And this is a common construction, a common myth about artistic talent. This fits within the myth of the modern artist as a kind of seer or prophet or mad genius, again being ahead of their time and so unrecognized in their own. This type of myth associates the artistic role with disorder and extremism, almost an outside sorcery, sometimes madness. And this is not a myth that, or a kind of association with artistic talent that's existed forever. It's actually a myth that began in the early 19th century in Europe with a group of artists called the Romantic movement. These myths are not really helpful to understanding the real circumstances or motivations of the artists. So we need to rescue Van Gogh from these sort of overly melodramatic myths in order to parse out what the real contributions of the painter were. So we're going to explore his biography, we're going to explore who he was, but also really what his contributions were to the history of art. Here's a really wonderful photograph of Vincent van Gogh at the age of 13. Now we say Van Gogh. If you were in French, you would say Van Gogh or Van Gogh if you were in the Netherlands where Vincent was born. He was born in the Netherlands in 1853. He was the child of a Protestant minister, Theodorus van Gogh, and his wife Anna. Strangely, this couple had another son, also named Vincent, that was born as a stillborn on the exact same date, precisely 1 year earlier. Theo, his brother that did survive, would become an art dealer and was Vincent's intellectual intimate, his supporter, really his closest friend, and biggest professional support throughout his life. The two brothers, Vincent and Theo, are buried next to each other in France today. Before Van Gogh became an artist, he failed at several professions. He tried his hand as an art dealer. He tried to be a boarding school teacher. He was an itinerant preacher on the countryside of Belgium. He tried out theological school. And his time, especially as a preacher in the countryside, really gave him a sensitivity to the rural poor. He was a very sympathetic man, a very religious person. Vincent often included little sketches of the sights and people that he saw in the letters he sent to his brother Theo, sometimes even enclosing a drawing of what he had seen. This eventually led to a turning point in his life when Theo, who became an art dealer, advised him to concentrate more on his drawing. So Van Gogh only first tried his hand as an artist at the age of 27, and he only spent the last 4 years of his life in France, the years 1886 to 1890, but they were important years, his most productive years. And he first moved to Paris in order to join with the Impressionist movement. Unfortunately, he moved to Paris in 1886, the year of the very last Impressionist group exhibition, another moment of sort of failure, a misstep in Van Gogh's career. So he eventually moved down to southern France to a town called Arles, A-R-L-E-S. And this is the town we see in the painting in front of you, the vineyard at Arles, which is now in a Russian museum. So this was quite a tragic life, a brief life of failure professionally, personally, and a life that ended with voluntary commitment into what they called an asylum and Van Gogh's own suicide. Van Gogh himself was acutely intelligent and self-aware of his failure, especially of his painting, which was unappreciated during his lifetime. Van Gogh only sold one painting, and it's the painting in front of you, the Red Vineyard at Arles from 1888. And this was even with his brother working as an art dealer, so even with this sort of nepotistic connection. He also failed at his relationships, both emotionally and sexually. At one point, he was in love with his cousin, another time, a pregnant prostitute. But his painting achievement is really remarkable in the short period when he began painting in 1880 and his death in 1890. So I said that Van Gogh moved to Paris in 1886, the year of Impressionism's death. It wasn't quite the death of Impressionism. Claude Monet lived until 1926, so Impressionism continued. But it was the year of the last group exhibition in the last year where we can say Impressionism was really kind of cutting edge and avant-garde. And it was also the year, 1886, of the first appearance of something called Post-Impressionism. This was a set of broad responses to Impressionism as this major art movement in France. And we can track symbolism as one of these possible post-Impressionist responses. Van Gogh thought of himself at first as an Impressionist, though. Like Claude Monet, a painting of whom you see at left, Van Gogh painted immediately from nature, so he wasn't inventing, right, spirits or mythological figures or imagined spaces in his paintings. He was painting what he saw, just like Monet and most of his Impressionist colleagues. And I should say, without going too deeply into the matter, if you're interested in Impressionism, I teach upper division classes in this. There was this fundamental tension in Impressionism, that these artists were representing the objective facts of vision in the moment that they saw them. They wanted to capture the world as their eyes saw it. And at the same time, they wanted to show the power of representation as a performance. In other words, by capturing nature quickly and with fidelity to human vision, the Impressionists left visible brushstrokes so you could track the hand of the artist as they took it down, which both added to the sense of optical reality, right, of a real impression, but also reminded you that this was dabs of paint, right, added to the surface of a canvas. So you were seeing nature, you were seeing vision captured, but mediated by paint. And this tension made Impressionism ultimately unstable, these kind of opposite impulses to showing the material matter of paint through these visible brushstrokes and this fidelity to optical vision. And so that's why Post-Impressionism offered a sort of range of reactions to Impressionism. Van Gogh was one of the artists that wanted to give meaning, sort of deeper and more spiritual meaning, to the pleasure-filled, hedonistic movement of Impressionism. Van Gogh wanted to inject or enliven Impressionist subjects with a kind of spiritual vitality. One of the criticisms of Impressionism, which is an incredibly interesting movement, is that it was sort of very surface level, that you had Impressionist paintings like the Monet painting you see at left that were merely about picnics or women in a garden or a day of boating, that there wasn't sort of much substantial being said about the human condition or the trajectory of urbanization or broader social problems or sort of life and death. And so Van Gogh wanted to give the Impressionist project sort of deeper meaning. You can see from this comparison that Van Gogh continued using some Impressionist strategies. He used vivid colors, you can see in the red vignette at Arles, drawn from Impressionist practice. Like the Impressionists, he used an often thick application of paint. If you go see the Van Gogh painting at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, you can see a technique called impasto. That's where the oil paint rises off the surface of the canvas, and you can really see it in 3 dimensions. And like the Impressionists, he is depicting real-life subject matter, right? Not imaginary subjects or spaces. But unlike the Impressionists, color in Van Gogh's hands is more arbitrary, more easily manipulated. He might not actually see the trees lining the top horizon of the red vignette at Arles in this sort of vivid turquoise, but he's playing with color a bit more. Van Gogh also does not consider light to be a medium for all appearance. Light is very important in the Impressionist capturing of optical vision, but in Van Gogh's hands, light has more of a symbolic character, and so Van Gogh is exploring the expressive potentials of things like color and light and gesture, rather than capturing the world as he sees it. Here I'm showing you a painting we'll spend some time with, Van Gogh's Thor Sunflowers Gone to Seed from 1887. This is a great example of Van Gogh's symbolist tendencies. Remember, this is a movement that emerged in part in the late 19th century in response to Impressionist practice. And symbolism began, like many visual arts movements, as a literary concept. And it was soon taken up by a younger generation of painters who wanted to reject the conventions of naturalism. In other words, wanted to reject that kind of surface level interest in optical reality that we saw the Impressionists use. Symbolist painters believed that art should reflect an emotion or an idea rather than merely representing the natural world in a kind of objective, quasi-scientific manner that was embodied in movements like realism or impressionism earlier in the century. So instead, symbolism was focused on personal expressivity. So symbolist painters felt that the symbolic value or meaning of a work of art stemmed from the recreation of emotional experiences in the viewer through the artist's use of color and line and composition. So they wanted to really replicate and stir emotions up in the viewer. In painting, symbolism represents a synthesis of form and feeling, of reality in the artist's inner life. Van Gogh once said, "With red and green I render the terrible passions of humanity." So he's representing not an optical reality, but an emotional reality. And his objects, right, that he is seeing out in the world, this isn't representing, right, a demon or an angel in order to communicate this sort of emotion or tone, but instead, real objects in the world become laden with symbolic weight. These 4 sunflowers you see in front of you seem to contain a kind of symbolic suffering. The stems have been cut, right? Van Gogh shows you the space on the stem where these sunflowers have been cut right from their living roots, and their petals are quite dramatic. They rise up from the surface of the flowers like licking flames, as if in revolt to the threatening decay, right? So there's a surprising vitality here in these flowers that's emphasized in these upward brush strokes, in the petals themselves, but also if you look in the background, right behind the flowers, you see these vertical brush strokes going up, up, up. Van Gogh, like many artists in France and Northern Europe, after the Enlightenment, after this very secular turn in Europe where rationality, science was emphasized over religious devotion. So after the Enlightenment, many artists were asking in Europe, how do you find in a secular world a convincing means of expressing those religious or spiritual experiences that before the 19th century had been channeled into themes of Christian art, right? People at this moment in a more secular world were still wondering, what happens when we die, how to deal with emotions like awe or fear, doubt or ecstasy, but instead of channeling those feelings into religious scenes or various deities, pictures of the divine. Artists needed to find new forms to channel these feelings. And so Van Gogh's sunflowers represent this really dramatic example of thinking about life, right, in celebratory or defiant revolt from inevitable death and decay, right? These flowers have been cut from their stems. They're not going to last forever, but they're quite energetic and beautiful in the meantime. Now, this doesn't mean that Van Gogh never pictured religious subject matter. He did. On the left, you see the church at Auvers from 1890, and the Sower at right from 1888. In Van Gogh's art, we sometimes do see a kind of nostalgia for the spiritual practices and transcendental values of earlier times. So we see Gothic architecture, sometimes crucifixes, an occasional monk. At right, the Sower is often a kind of parable for especially Christian practice of evangelizing to others, so sort of planting seeds of spiritual development. At left, the church was a real church, again, that Van Gogh saw in the town of Auvers-sur-Oise, a place that he lived. This was a church that was built in the 13th century in the Gothic style. And so this is a real piece of architecture, but in Van Gogh's hands, it turns into a kind of flamboyant monument, right? Look at the sort of waving lines of the rooftop of this church. That is not how the church looked, right? Look at the waving lines of the lines where the architecture meets the grass in front of the church. This church looks like it's pulsing, right? Like it contains this sort of vibrating energy. And being situated between these two diverging paths in front of it, it looks like it's almost on the verge of dislocating itself from the ground, right? Or clasping to the ground as if in between two torrents of lava. So it's really sort of energized here. If one compares this painting with Claude Monet's paintings of a cathedral in Rouen in France, this is one painting from a very, very famous series of Monet's where he paints the facade of this one cathedral at various times of day. So they take on pinkish tints and bluish tints during different times of day. So these were painted quite close together, right, within 2 years of each other. But you can measure here how different Van Gogh's approach was to the Impressionists. Unlike Monet, Van Gogh did not try to render the impression of the play of light on the monument. And this is really why Monet was interested in the face of a cathedral. It's this texture, there's all these niches and sculptures and recessed spaces, right, where shadow takes over moments where light hits the three-dimensional architecture a bit more. So Monet wasn't interested in the cathedral as a Christian building, but instead he thought this was a kind of interesting surface to explore the effects of light on. For Van Gogh, however, the fact that this building was a church was completely essential to him selecting it as an object. The artistic means used by Van Gogh, this giving liveliness, injecting emotion or a kind of spiritual gravity or energy into the church, is going to anticipate the work of later modern movements, the Fauvists, the expressionist painters, painters that were interested in the kind of inner lives, the emotional underbelly to the world. This is Van Gogh's Olive Trees with Blue Sky, painted in June of 1889. You start to see more precise dating on some of Van Gogh's later works because he's moving closer to his death, but this also tells us that at this moment that Van Gogh painted this, he was living in Arles, but he was living in an institution or an asylum at Saint-Remy. This is nearby Arles in Provence. And we can see during his time at this institution a stylistic shift. Now, you read in your article for today, and this article is really essential to understanding Van Gogh's role in our class, that there were two primary natural motifs or subjects that dominate Van Gogh's work, especially when he was in residence at this institution. One of those subjects were cypress trees, which we'll see 2 slides from now, but the other were olive orchards. Now, cypresses and olives were both trees that Van Gogh would have seen in this region in southern France. They were characteristic of this area in Provence. So he was still painting what he could observe around him. This is a place in France with kind of dry, stony hills. This was not fertile with agriculture. You wouldn't see sort of fields of water-demanding plants. So this was natural to see olive trees there. But there is a symbolic element here too, right? There are plenty of other kinds of trees and landscapes that Van Gogh could have sought out, but he was interested in the symbolic element too. The fact that olive trees can survive in kind of hard scrabble environments, that they're really resilient and surviving where other things could not, that seemed to be important to Van Gogh, especially at this moment of a mental health crisis in his life. And we see them depicted here in the kind of sweltering heat. The land looks pretty arid and dry around these crooked and twisting trunks and branches. You get a sense of atmosphere, sort of hot atmosphere, rising off of this olive grove in Provence. And I want you to look at the trunks of these trees. You can see Van Gogh using these long brushstrokes for the tree trunks and the branches. But the majority of the rest of the painting, the ground, the leaves of these olive trees, and the sky, are painted in short, curved brushstrokes. Look at how different that sky is, for instance, than other paintings you may have seen, right? Other depictions of sky, where you might not even, the brushstrokes have been erased by the artist's hand. This technique makes the air appear to vibrate, right? And the heat in the olive grove almost palpable. Without painting the sun itself, he uses the brushstrokes to communicate the sun's energy and the power of nature and the resilience of these trees as a result. So in Van Gogh's hand, these olive trees act as kind of tough outcasts relegated to marginal landscapes. And when Van Gogh retreated to the asylum at Saint-Remy, he was in need of a kind of antidote to the decadent society around him, right? The society that had failed him, that didn't understand him. Perhaps that was part of the cause of his psychological distress. Nature became a salve in Van Gogh's hand at the time. He paints it as with this serenity, with its own energy, a very different energy than the bustling, modern, overwhelming city. And this was a moment in Europe and in France especially where cities were were exploding, becoming crowded, were becoming filled with factories and industrialization and pollution. And so southern France offered a kind of respite from that overwhelming scene. olive trees in particular represented a more ancient or traditional culture. They stood out as being out of step with modern agriculture, with the time. They represented a kind of nostalgia. Van Gogh also wanted to express a sense of spiritual longing, right? A need for a vision, kind of working out his feelings about heaven or an afterlife. The olive trees, in part, offered a kind of consolation for mortality without using traditional Christian imagery. So here we have in the olive trees, with the appeals in the background, a kind of somber and dramatic mood. You feel the proximity of those rocky hills in the background that are depicted in such beautiful shades of blue and indigo. So you feel kind of closed in and compressed. And Van Gogh shows the swelling rhythm of the earth. Look at those undulating bits of earth in the foreground of this painting that rhyme with the swelling rhythm of those swirling clouds and the undulating mountains. The twisting olive trees, right, twisting even more than the painting we just saw, show them struggling to maintain a grasp on the earth around them. So Van Gogh was painting landscapes and objects around him, but with this expressive effect, right? He told his brother he wanted to create a style that would, quote, give consolation without a return to the romantic or religious ideas. In fact, as you read, he painted a scene of Christ in the Garden of Olives twice in 1888. In the Christian Bible, Jesus Christ goes to the Mount of Olives after the Last Supper to pray about his coming crucifixion. And this is a very dramatic moment in the Christian Bible where he says, Father, take this cup from me, right? He's struggling with the idea of his upcoming death, right, and suffering. And then he eventually says, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done, right? I'm sort of giving up this to you, but really this moment of intense desperation and suffering, and also acceptance of his own coming suffering and death. So the olive grove, right, was the scene of really intense human emotion and also the grace of divine sacrifice, of Jesus Christ coming to terms with his own death. And so we can see this biblical scene, this interest in the olive grove coming through in Van Gogh's paintings of this kind of moment. But here, right, he scrapes out the image of Christ being confronted by an angel. At this moment, he had a kind of distrust for religious institutions as ultimate guides for morality. So he had tried to go to seminary, to religious school. He had tried to be a preacher, but it wasn't a satisfying way to express or channel those spiritual feelings that he had. And he was part of this increasingly secular society. He needed a new way to express things like existential distress, but also comfort about human death and the afterlife. And so we see him using nature as a means to do so. Wheatfield and Cypresses from 1889 is a similar landscape. We have olive trees in the left middle ground. You can see the little bluish tree. It looks quite short here. And also a cypress, which you read about in your article. And everything in this beautiful painting is shown through contrasting color and this intense movement of form. Every brushstroke is vibrating, is curved, is moving. So we have an olive tree at left and a cypress at right, creating between them a kind of climbing diagonal that moves up toward this cypress. And the cypress is that dark green tree that is quite a vertical tree. You may have seen some out in the wild. And this cypress really bursts from a fairly flat landscape into this intense vertical ascent here. Everything in this canvas is constructed from convulsing shapes. There's a kind of restless dynamism, a restless energy in this painting. And considered symbolically, as you read, the cypress tree can be seen as a bridge between life and death, or earth and the sky, which is commonly associated with heaven. Cypresses were also regarded as trees of the graveyard and of mourning. Cypresses are often planted in cemeteries in Mediterranean countries because they stay green all year. And because of this, they're associated with the gods of the underworld. It's also believed that cypresses are associated with immortality because they stay green all year long and have quite long lives. So this is an expressive shape, right? It might have been an interesting tree for Van Gogh to explore formally with its kind of vertical shape, but it's expressive. It has this other symbolic weight in Van Gogh's hands, connecting the earth and the sky like a soaring Egyptian obelisk. And I'll show you one of those next. I'm showing you an obelisk at left. This was an obelisk from Egypt, from Luxor in Egypt, photographed in 1857. So this was a kind of Egyptian monument that was known to Europeans in Van Gogh's lifetime. Obelisks are tall, four-sided, kind of narrowly taping monuments which end in a pyramid-like shape. The Washington Monument in D.C. is in the shape of an obelisk. There were prominent obelisks taken from Egypt in Paris and in Arles in the 19th century. These were taken as spoils of war often. And in ancient Egypt, they marked the entrance to temples, right, to religious buildings, symbolizing the sun god, right, reaching up with their dramatic pointers or pyramid to almost touch the sun. And so cypresses were seen as natural obelisks, having these associations with death and transition and immortality. In 1889, Vincent wrote to his brother Theo, describing the inspiration for one of his most famous paintings, again, a painting you might be familiar with from movies or pop culture, Starry Night. And this is a painting that you can visit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He wrote, "This morning I saw the countryside from my window a long time before sunrise, with nothing but the morning star, which looked very big." The window that he refers to was in the St. Paul Asylum in Saint-Rémy in southern France, where, as we've discussed, he sought a kind of respite from his emotional suffering and psychological distress while he continued to make art. Now, this composition is interesting, but should be really familiar to you, especially based on the previous canvas. It's balanced and expressive both. He structures his composition with this ordered placement of the cypress tree, again, which is in the left foreground. There's also a church steeple in the middle of the painting that rises above the village. And these stars and planets that he represents in the sky through countless short brushstrokes and thickly applied paint that sets the whole surface of this canvas in a kind of roiling motion. The canvas is really dominated by this sky, right? If you kind of count up the real estate of this canvas, most of it is dedicated to the sky. About 3/4 of the picture plane has this kind of turbulent, agitated, intensely swirling patterns that seem to roll across the surface like waves. So the sky is pocked with these bright orbs of light, including a crescent moon, and Venus, the morning star, to the left of center, all surrounded by concentric circles of radiant white and yellow light. Art historian Albert Boehm wrote about the potential linkage of stars and planets to an afterlife, especially from the writings of Victor Hugo and Jules Verne, and the possible, their belief in the afterlife on stars or planets. Beneath this expressive sky sits a hushed village of humble houses surrounding a church whose steeple rises sharply above the undulating blue-black mountains in the middle ground. And I should say that this church is likely one of the very few kind of imagined objects we see in Van Gogh's work. He likely would not have seen a church like this from the asylum in southern France. That looks more like a church you would see in the Netherlands where Van Gogh grew up. So he's sort of moving nostalgically back in time there. And a cypress tree, of course, right, sits in that left foreground. It reaches up again like a flame, almost to the top edge of the canvas, serving as this visual link between land and sky. Again, from your article, this is symbolic. The cypress was seen as a bridge between life, represented by the earth, and death, represented by the sky, commonly associated with heaven. The cypress, again, is this tree of the graveyard, a tree of mourning, of immortality. Cypresses are close in Van Gogh's mind to those sunflowers, right? The life force of golden suns that we saw in the 4 sunflowers gone to seed. But cypresses are like these black flames in this painting, absorbing the light, not giving the light. But they're also more lasting than sunflowers. They're not as beholden to cycles of sunshine and death, right? They live for a longer time. They're everlasting. They represent a kind of afterlife with their association with death. Again, those stars too represent the afterlife through Jules Verne and Victor Hugo. Also, Van Gogh once wrote, "But the sight of stars always makes me dream. Why, I say to myself, should the spots of light in the firmament be less accessible to us than the black spots on the map of France? Just as we take the train to go to Tarascon or Rouen, we take death to go to a star." So Starry Night is based on Van Gogh's direct observations, as well as his imagination, his memories, his emotions. He's thinking back to his childhood. He's imagining the potential spaces one travels to in the afterlife. And so this is one of the reasons that this painting has been so popular, so meaningful, so effective in the years after Van Gogh's death, right? It's not just a scene of a provincial village at night. This has been imbued with these incredibly loaded symbols, right? Symbols about persistence and immortality and death, and acceptance of death and resistance to death. And that's why I think this painting continues to draw crowds at MoMA even today. If you go visit this painting when we're traveling again, right, there's always a crowd in front of it at MoMA. And so even if people aren't acknowledging or, aware of the specific meanings behind its symbolic weight, it carries this energy, right? It carries the sense of dynamism and importance and a weightiness that people are willing to spend a lot of time with. Wheatfield with Reaper is the painting we began our talk today with, and it was produced during a period of hospitalization, as we discussed. We have the positivity of the vivid, sort of golden colors, the dancing yellow wheat, which is undermined only slightly by the heavy symbolic presence of the reaper toiling beneath the sickly sky. And the reaper, again, is a real task one must do in agriculture, to cut down and collect the wheat. But it also, traditionally in the West, has this association with death, right? Many images of death show death as a kind of personified figure holding that sickle, right? That crescent-shaped tool that a reaper uses. Death is even called the reaper sometimes. So there's this symbolic connection between the cutting down and collecting of wheat and the cutting down and collecting of human lives here. In another letter to his brother, Van Gogh proposed that humanity might be the wheat that this figure is reaping. So he's making these symbolic connections explicitly in his letters. That's one of the tools of evidence art historians can use. So why is Van Gogh's art considered to be one of the great triumphs in the history of modern art in the West? One of the most tempting explanations is psychological, right? That he was this mad prophet, that his psychological distress gave him unique insights into the essential parts of life, that he was sort of playing at a higher frequency. But this is a really simplistic definition. Van Gogh was engaged with really sophisticated avant-garde theories of form and color in his lifetime. His use of color is connected to other post-impressionists. He sets off, say, greens against reds, or in this painting you can see yellows against purples, these colors that sit as opposites on the color spectrum. And a lot of avant-garde or cutting-edge artists at this moment in post-impressionism believed that these color contrasts set off vibrations in your eyeball, that they created these meaningful, energetic responses in the rods and cones of your eye. So he was really sophisticated in his approach to color and form in his lifetime. But his biography is somewhat unavoidable. He entered this downward spiral after a proposed partnership with another artist in his lifetime, Gauguin. He wanted to create a kind of utopian artists colony with Gauguin in Arles, but they ended up fighting quite badly. Gauguin left town. Van Gogh had a series of breakdowns. He was institutionalized. He very famously cut off one of his ears and delivered it to a prostitute he admired. The town of Arles then petitioned for his institutionalization. But he worked, right, during this period in so-called asylums. He was prolific, even in moments of acute distress. The last 2 months of his life, he created 75 paintings. That's a lot. But he died in July of 1890, 2 days after shooting himself in a wheat field, in fact. At the moment of his death, he saw his career as a failure, right? He barely showed any work publicly. He only sold one painting. But after his death, of course, he became well known. His canvases earned stratospheric prices for their owners. There were some theories, and if you're interested in this, there's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down, that his psychological breakdowns had other medical explanations, that he might have had epilepsy, that he was poisoned by the toxic materials in the paints that he was using. Remember, this is the 19th century. You weren't buying your paints from Blick. They were being made from often toxic materials. So there are explanations, and the biography is connected, right, to the content of his paintings. We can't sort of avoid that altogether. And plenty of his paintings really suggest his disintegrating mental health and his obsession with death, including this wheat field with Reaper. And this painting too, his Crows in the Wheat Field from 1890. This is the last painting you'll see if you visit the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. It's often claimed that this was his very last canvas. It might not be his literal last, but it was pretty close to it. And this is quite a dark and menacing painting. You see a menacing sky with crows rising from the wheat field. In front of us, in the center of the composition, is a path that dead ends. And this was done close to Auvers, where Van Gogh would commit suicide, again, also in a field much like this one. But also, right, there are many of his works that are not just reacting in madness and aren't connected with death at all. Van Gogh's portraits won't take, I could do a whole lecture on his portraits, but I'll show this self-portrait from 1887, which lives in the Detroit Institute of Arts, just to say that Van Gogh had this very self-aware, analytical intensity, and his portraits, his self-portraits and also his portraits of others, are really wonderful. He captures the liveliness of his sitters, and you can see one of these portraits again in the museum here at OU. So he gives them life through these undulating brushstrokes, through that energy he's able to imbue in his paintings. But he's also using, again, these very cutting edge and interesting color techniques, setting these color opposites next to each other in close conversation. The face of Van Gogh is made up of a wild diversity of colors that, again, gives it this kind of energy and formal interest that we don't see in the work of too many artists before this point. So he was an incredibly sophisticated, self-aware artist, interesting beyond these sort of darker aspects of his biographical, of his own story. Van Gogh is an artist who had incredible formal and emotional complexity. There's irony in his paintings, self-consciousness, an incredible power over symbolic expression here. And we need to see his formal innovations along with his emotional intensity. In this unit, in Art as Spiritual Expression, Van Gogh is an interesting example to artists struggling with a very modern problem about how to rechannel spiritual experience outside of the traditions of institutional religion, of Christian art in this case, right? We've seen artists struggling for thousands of years working out how you represent divinity, mortality, immortality through artistic expression, right? How art is used to pose some of these big questions about life and also answer some of them. And Van Gogh is doing this in a more secular world. And this is something that artists today, right, grapple with. How do you channel spiritual experience, spiritual questions outside of those older traditions, outside of Christian or Islamic or Judaic iconography?